So today we're going to be talking about Chapter 4 of the crash course. Totally. In fact, we won't have time to cover everything in Chapter 4, but I'm going to hold you responsible for everything on the PowerPoint that I'm about to begin. Actually, what's in the PowerPoint is almost everything that's in Chapter 4 of the crash course. It's not a long chapter, and so you could read that chapter in probably less than an hour. It's important that you know these things. The point of the crash course was how to, in fact, I started writing the crash course before I ever had a teaching job because I needed a way of teaching, more specifically, the writing portions to people who had never had any journalism courses before. And so they had good spelling and grammar. They came to me, wanted to be freelance writers, freelance reporters. They had other jobs or other responsibilities, but they wanted to write. And I needed a way to quickly teach them how to be a reporter. And so that's when I actually started writing the crash course, was then. And then when I did accept my first teaching job soon thereafter, I inherited a course called Advanced News Reporting, I think it was, and it had a really thick textbook, about this thick, about news reporting. And I realized that was absurd. To get my students to read a book that thick, I would have to have lots of quizzes, and they would have very little time for writing, because they'd be so busy preparing to do quizzes that there would be no time left. And I personally would be spending all my time preparing quizzes based on this thick book and would not have time to give them a lot of feedback on very many writing projects. So in my way of thinking, a book that thick on reporting was absurd. They would not remember it, and they would not have improved their skills and prepared for the real world if I made them do it. So I pretty much threw that book away and started using my own material, which is this very short crash course. And I had them doing lots of writing, which is exactly what the executives told me that I needed to do when I asked them in my survey of now well over 1,000 executives. I asked them, how do I teach my students how to write better? And it became it's an open-ended question, and then it became a cliche. They'd write to me in their survey, have the students write, and write some more. And so that, again, as I said, was in total contradiction with trying to get them to digest a book that thick. And so I threw the book away, taught them out of my own book, we created a news service for which they were writing news stories for weekly newspapers around the Buffalo, New York area. And a lot of them thanked me later for the jobs they were able to get by learning how to write properly. So I started writing this crash course then. I finished it finished the first version of it while I was a professor in Buffalo. And it was intended to be quite short, because ultimately you learn better by doing stuff than by reading and trying to memorize. So what I believe is in the crash course is exactly what you need to remember. You need to really remember what's in the crash course. There's not much there. You need to know it. And so I'm going to try to go through as much of Chapter 4 as I can today, but you are responsible for that chapter when next time we come up with a quiz and with the final exam, because you need to know this. What is wrong with this headline? This comes from the newspaper that I used to work for, but I luckily quit before this came along. I mentioned to some of you I was voluntarily the late night editor, which meant I was the last person to check all the pages of the newspaper before it went to press, and then even stayed and watched the first copies of the newspaper coming off the press and made sure there were no glaring errors like this. If those of you that don't know what pubic means, is basically this part of your body, your pubic area. Well, that's not the word they meant to write. They meant to write public. And the problem with spell check is that it doesn't check stupidity. It only checks misspelled words. And pubic is not a misspelled word. And in fact, it kind of fits after this, a lot of our readers made fun of it. This ended up on not national news, but a national comedy show because of how weird it was. But if you start thinking about all the places where you could replace the word public with pubic, it actually makes some sense. A naughty sense, a irreverent sense, whatever, but it's not what you want to have show up and have people laughing at you. Later on, after this, I took my first job in PR marketing, my first full-time job anyway, and we were always having public hearings. And so I was always having to check myself to make sure. In fact, I did catch myself sometimes misspelling public, as in public hearing. It was a meeting you have where you invite in the public to discuss a new engineering project or something. So this was extremely embarrassing. Like I said, I had actually left the newspaper. Otherwise, this would have been my responsibility to catch this as late night editor. Of course, somebody else had the responsibility to catch it before I got to it. In fact, our policy was that every editor, it became a slogan, every editor needs an editor. So even though the editors are editing the work of the reporters, they also have to edit each other's work. And so before we were to send a news page to the printer, whoever did this page, who would have, since it was a front page, it was the front page of the newspaper, he should have had somebody else checking that page for him to make sure he didn't do something stupid. I don't know if they both missed it. And being the front page, you would have thought that even the managing editor of a medium-sized newspaper would have checked the page. He would have wanted to look at it. But so it should have been looked at by 4 people. The editor who created it, the other editor that the first editor asked to check it, somebody else, news editor or the managing editor, somebody higher up, because it was the front page, maybe not the rest of the page, but the front page somebody should have been looking at, and then the late editor should have caught it. And if it had been me, I hope I would have caught it. But I had just a little bit before this resigned and gone into PR marketing, so I was gone, luckily. It wasn't my problem. Another editor problem we talked about in some of the tutorials. I mentioned this is the case of Janet Cooke, who was a Pulitzer Prize winner for the Washington Post. At least she was a Pulitzer Prize winner until they found out that she made up all the stories she wrote. Her story was about a young boy that she supposedly had interviewed extensively and kind of followed around in his life, and about his parents being on drugs and all the drug dealers that were coming after him, the times he was beaten up and stuff. He was supposedly lived in the bad part of Washington, D.C., and she wrote so well, she won a Pulitzer Prize. And then the Associated Press started checking her CVs and saw they weren't consistent. She said one thing in one CV and something else in another CV resume, and then they raised questions to the Washington Post, and I had a chance to interview one of the editors. It wasn't Ben Bradley, it was a different editor, one of their editors, who said they basically then had to take her into a room and interrogate her like she was a criminal suspect, because they realized that she was going to lie on her CV to get the job. What else would she lie about? And in this case, as I mentioned in the tutorial to some of you, it was before the big newspapers had a policy that nobody has an anonymous source unless an editor knows who that source is. I don't know that they still have that. There are so many anonymous sources in American newspapers today, I can't possibly believe that they are keeping this rule. But both the Washington Post and the New York Times were burned by reporters who made up stories and made up sources. And this was one of them, where obviously she had to give up her Pulitzer Prize, again, the top prize in news writing in America. And I have my serious doubts that she was ever accepted back into journalism again. after this. So whose fault was it? Certainly the fault starts with her, but it also is the fault of editors. Editors have the responsibility to make sure the reporters are reporting properly. Now this would be more, first of all, the fault of the content editor. So in the medium-sized newspaper I was at, most of the stories went through the Metro editor. And so it was his responsibility to make sure that this was a true story. At the time, we didn't have a lot of anonymous sources in the community where I was at, so it didn't come up a lot. But again, both the New York Times, this would have happened before I joined the staff of the daily newspaper. And so they should have had this experience. They should have seen what happened here. The whole world saw what happened here. And so every newspaper in America was on alert. You have to be careful about giving your reporters so much freedom that they can make up, that there's any possibility of them making up sources, making up interviews. So that is ultimately the fault of the editors. They have to accept the responsibility as the overseers of the reporters. Certainly the reporter was, like I said, her career probably ended with this. It was an early career and she had a bright future until she did this. But whose responsibility for this? This is a photo that was run by the Associated Press until so many newspapers protested that this was a photo that was without any real news value and was extremely in poor taste. Wasn't illegal, wasn't unethical per se, but it was in poor taste. Nobody wanted to see this photo of where this kid tried to climb over a fence and fell down and got the fence pole going right through his throat up into through his up through his throat, up through his mouth. Nobody particularly wanted to see this. It was not a great news value. So why did we send this out? And so they pulled this photo back. Whose responsibility was it? The photographer is just doing his job. He hands those photos over to the editors. He's far less responsible for his photos and how they're used than a reporter is. A bad reporter is with what he writes, because he's just taking lots of pictures. And so it's ultimately the editor who decides whether or not this is going to be run or sent out, in this case, by the Associated Press. This is one where, as it says in the caption, the photograph published by the Rushfield Republican prompted a flurry of complaints from readers. The children of the woman in the photo died in the fire. This one's harder. This one has news value. I can tell you that from my personal experience, I worked for I worked for a big city newspaper, and then the city where I worked in the daily, and then started my own paper and worked against the daily, was a medium-sized city, not a real big city. In either of those cases, probably this would not have been a major problem. The smaller the city you work in, or especially if you're in more of a village than a city, this is a major problem. People in a smaller city or in a town, in a village, whatever you want to call it, if you offend one person, you've offended at least half the people, and they're not real happy with you. That's actually what happened to me when I bought my first newspaper. It was a small city, and I came in having worked in a big city. There's actually since then been research to show that big city reporting or newspapers tend to be what they call conflict-oriented, in that they report conflicts. You go to city council, you report the debate, you report the argument between the city councilmen. Whereas in most smaller towns, particularly weekly newspapers, and typically cover smaller towns, they tend to be consensus-oriented, in that if they go to city council, they don't report the debate and the arguments the people in city council had. They report the final vote, and that's it. They might report a little bit the reason why they voted that way. They won't report why some people opposed it. Because again, even in a city council meeting, you report one side. If you offend somebody, If you embarrass them if you are conflict-oriented, they consider they've been embarrassed, that you reported that they had this big argument in a city council meeting. And so half the people in town know or are related to that person. And so you have a whole bunch of people, a large proportion of your readers get mad at you about that. Well, I remember one piece of research I started studying when I then sold my small newspaper and went back for my master's degree. Their theory or their hypothesis in their research was that it was financially based, that a person at a smaller newspaper, largely because of the discontent they could create by reporting conflict or something like this, that they would then suffer financially from doing that. And their conclusion was they found no evidence that it was a financial problem. And that's exactly what I found. I doubled my revenue, and I had people mad at me all the time because I was a conflict-oriented editor in a small town. And so I doubled my revenue, and after a couple of years, I figured, hey, I'm going to take my profit and get out of here. I don't like this environment where I can't be a true reporter in my book. A true reporter is going to report conflicts, and the small town doesn't want conflicts. So adios, I'm leaving. I'm going back to school. So I took my profit and paid for my master's degree and went on with my career. But this is the sort of thing that in a smaller city, and this, I've never even heard of this town before, Rushville, I don't know where it's at. So I have to presume it's a small town or small city. And so they're far more likely to be impacted by running a photo like this than in a bigger city. It is, I'm sorry for the lady whose children were killed, but this is very much a news photo. This depicts the terror, the emotions of everything. If you're going to be a news person, you have to be able to report the bad news. And this photo encapsulates the bad news, that there was a major fire and this poor woman lost her children in it. I'm deeply sorry for her. But as a news person, you have to report the news. But this is one of those, again, in a small town, small city, is undoubtedly going to get more protests than in a big city. The people, there might be a few people that still complain about this photo in a larger city, but their numbers will be so small that an editor will realize they represent such a small percentage of their readers that they won't take them too seriously, and they'll go on. And in fact, and the people themselves realize that this is such a big newspaper, nobody cares about me, so to speak. Her and her relatives would think that, well, they don't care about me. Again, they can care about them, but they still run the photo because that's their job. This is what I mentioned in class the other day, where somebody came into the newspaper itself and shot some people dead. So this would hit much closer to home because now these were their friends. These were people the editor himself knew, and all the editors knew, and the photographer knew. Everybody knew this person because he was one of their press people for the newspaper. Now, do you run this? And the answer was, we had to. This told the story about what happened. If we're going to run this story, if we're going to run this sort of story, we have to run this sort of story. Even though it's much closer to home and we feel much more emotional about it. This could have been us. This could have, we could have been the one in that photo when this guy came in and started shooting our fellow workers. So this is the editor's responsibility. Now, I did go over a little bit about the editing process in some of the tutorials. I know I missed it in at least one. But I went ahead and took that list, and I wanted to compare the responsibilities of a content editor with those of a copy editor. And so these basically are the responsibilities of a content editor. So this would be your metro editor. This would be your sports editor. This would be your features editor. This would be your national editor. This would be your state editor. If in a big city, they might have an education editor. The larger the organization, the more content editors they will have. And so the content editor is responsible, first off, they're going to get that story from each reporter, and they're going to read the entire story to try to get an idea of, okay, what's here, what is newsworthy, and they'll be looking at the bigger picture, like, does it run smoothly? Did they ask all the questions? Did they interview all the key people? Those are very, very important questions to the content editor, because he, like the editor, whoever handled the Janet Cooke story, has to ascertain, did this person do his or her job right? Ultimately, was he making up quotes, among other things? But all the other questions about, did he ask the right people the right questions? Has it told the whole story? Does the story itself flow in such a way that it flows smoothly, and our readers will enjoy, if you can, the story because it's written well enough for them to go through smoothly, and they don't have to stop and ask themselves questions and have doubts or whatever. Is the story written well? Is the content good? The people in the Metro desk or the content editors would be the first ones to start fact checking. They are the ones that have time to do some fact checking. You'll see when I go to the copy editor, they do fact checking too. That doesn't alleviate from them the responsibility to check facts. But the content editor he will start receiving stories early in the day. The content editor usually comes in a daily newspaper in America. The paper comes out early in the morning. And so the reporters start working in the morning. They have some flexible time, depending whether they know they have to work at night or not. If they have a meeting they have to go to in the evening. So some of them come in quite early. Others come in, they might wait till noon because they know they're going to be working late that night. They have some flexible time depending on what they're going to be writing. And so they start drifting in any time in the morning and may not get in until after lunch. The content editors, kind of the same thing. They will probably leave unless it's a really important news day, the executive editor will be gone by 8 or 9 o'clock in the evening. The copy editors will be there until after 12, 12:30, 1 o'clock. As the late editor, I was there until about 2 o'clock, making the last checks and making sure the paper was coming out properly and giving the okay to the press. Okay, you're ready to run, go with it. But anyway, they do have time. My point is they come in early enough that they have time to start reading the stories early. The copy editors may not come until 3 or 4 in the afternoon because, as I said, they're going to be there till after midnight. And so the copy editors have the latest shift of all, and so they have the least time and the least capability of fact checking, because if they don't start until 4 o'clock, they don't start seeing the stories. Some of the stories they may not see until after 9 o'clock. So how much fact checking can you do? It's going to have to be fairly easy to check facts, like what can I find nowadays on the internet to verify this person's name or their title or something like that. They're not going to be able to do a lot of phone calls. They've had to depend on the content editor and the reporter himself to have done the job right. Nonetheless, so probably the biggest responsibility for the big picture and the fact checking is the content editor. Revision, if the content editor feels like he can fix a story, well, first off, he has to ask himself the question, if this needs revision, who's going to do the revision? Is it going to be me, or am I going to hand it back to the reporter to do his job better? And very frequently, they hand that story right back to the reporter and say, here, you didn't do your job right. Go interview these other people, go do this, whatever they might tell them, and send it back to the reporter. But then whenever they think they have an adequately written story from the reporter, whether it's the first draft or the second draft or whenever, then they're the first ones to decide, okay, do I need to rewrite the lead? Do I need to do some other rewriting to make this flow right? And so then they make the first stab at it. And that pretty much at that point ends the job of the content editor. Then the content editor hands it off to the copy editor. One of you had a lot of questions about the relationship. Particularly, there's an organizational chart that is very confusing in the newer version of this book, because it suggests that the head of the copy desk chief, is the boss of the content editors, and I've never seen that be the case, and I don't think that's what the organizational chart intended to mean. But there has been a trend where content editors, it used to be that in fact, in smaller newspapers like the one I was at, basically all the copy editors handle all the stories. I mean, basically we work as one group, and whether we're copy editing sports stories or feature stories or hard news stories, we're all in one copy desk. In fact, it used to be, when it was being done by hand, that it was done around a circular sort of desk, with the person in the middle being the copy desk chief. And so the textbook does refer to rim editors, referring to copy editors who were around the rim of this circular desk. I don't think that exists anyplace anymore, having a circular desk. We're doing things by computers, and so things get passed by one person to another person through the computer network. And so I don't know of any newspapers that still truly have a rim anymore. But what has happened, and I remember earlier editions of this book said it was a trend, but it had not yet caught on yet, a decade ago. But now they're saying that it is the norm of daily newspapers, or at least of larger daily newspapers, and by the way, let me say that there's 10,000 newspapers in America. And so when they start talking about the big metropolitan newspapers, they're probably talking about, out of the 10,000, they're probably talking about 100. There are 100 really large newspapers in major cities. And so the newspapers that they would be talking about with this organizational chart would be about 100 newspapers out of 10,000 newspapers. So, but they're the ones that get all the attention: the New York Times, the Washington Post, the LA Times, so forth. 33 of them are those that I downloaded a front page for. And it might be slightly more than 100, but I don't think it's 200 that would in any way need the sort of organization depicted in the organizational chart in the book. But getting back to what I was starting to say, now they decided that assigning copy editors to go work directly with some of these content areas, some of the content editors, made sense. Let them go work directly with them. And so maybe one copy editor might work with the education content editor. The Metro editor would have a lot more reporters, and so they might assign 5 copy editors to work with the Metro editor. The national editor in a large metro, maybe a couple of copy editors to him. Again, it depends on the newspaper. The international desk, with that content editor, again, maybe 2 copy editors at most. It just depends on how much flow they have coming in on these content areas. How many copy editors do we need to assign to these people? And they might still have people on the rim, so to speak, people working directly with the copy editor chief in his geographic vicinity, and also very directly responsible to him in what they're doing. And those people are going to be basically catching everything that the overflow, you might say. And so maybe the national editor of a metro newspaper might have 1 copy editor, and suddenly they get a whole bunch of stories, important stories. So the copy desk chief would say, "Hey, can you work with the national desk today?" And so geographically, they wouldn't move their desk over by the national editor, but they would start receiving stories from him and putting pages together on behalf of the national desk. So, but nonetheless, the idea of having a team, a content editor with his own copy editors, however many, depending on the amount of work they had to do, made sense. And so that was the trend 10 years ago, and it's now, they're saying, the reality of essentially every major metropolitan newspaper. But let me again emphasize, that may be 100 out of 10,000 newspapers in America. And so that is not, if you count all the newspapers, that's not the norm. That may be the norm for the big metropolitan newspapers. It's not the norm for all newspapers. In fact, it'd be pretty hard to find a norm because, like for the newspapers I ran, I had to do both. I was the copy editor and the content editor both, and I liked it that way. I liked being very busy and involved with everything that I could be, and I was the lead reporter because I never had a reporter that I thought could report and write as well as I did. So I'd end up with a lot of the front page stories myself, which I also liked. You notice that this front page, this first slide of the copy editor, is basically the same as the first slide of the content editor. Just I pushed one item over to the next slide, but basically read the text, look at the big picture, check facts. Those don't go away for the copy editor. He may depend a little bit more on the content editor to have done these things, but it doesn't alleviate him of the responsibility to do them also. So if he has any question about any of the facts, he has to check it. If he has any problem with the big picture of the story, he may go back directly to the reporter, or he may go back to the content editor and raise questions that he didn't think the content editor did adequately. He definitely is going to read the story right off the bat to get the full idea of what's going on in the story. And then the copy editor is going to go in with a fine-tooth comb, and this one means basically go through this story very, very carefully. You're going to look for typos, you're going to look for the bad punctuation, you're going to fix any usage, you're going to correct the grammar, you're going to make sure that everything goes by Associated Press style or your version of it. Again, a lot of newspapers, especially the big metropolitan newspapers, have made their own version of the AP style book. Or the newspaper I was at had like 5 exceptions to the AP style book. So they said, go by the AP style book except these 5 cases. We're going to change for us. So they had a few exceptions to the AP style book, including they wanted to use courtesy titles in the daily paper I was at, which violates the AP style. When we sent our stories to Associated Press, we had to re-edit it and send it to them in their style because that was the requirement. Again, they keep the cost very low for the members of the Associated Press because the Associated Newspapers, which are in well over 1,000 newspapers, are contributing stories to the AP, which they share to everybody else. So they keep their costs down, and they keep the cost down for the newspapers themselves. So the copy editors do go through it much more carefully for the grammar and spelling and style and everything than the content editor will do. And so then we will revise, and if you read the text underneath the revision, the text under this revision is somewhat different than the text under the other one. The other one talks about sending it back to the reporter. By now, that's very frequently not even an option. The reporter may have gone home. And so even if we wanted to send it back to the reporter, we can't. If we have to call them and ask about something, we will. But pretty much by the time it gets to the copy editor, we're on our own. And so any revisions we have to take responsibility for. And it is ultimately, we're the last one to work it. We're the last one to work the story, so we own it. The copy desk owns that story once we receive it, and we do whatever we want to and face whatever consequences if we make a mistake. It's our job to make sure that this story goes out good. And so after revision, then we are the ones. I was a little surprised. Again, somebody who's responsible for presenting one of the chapters related to this said that the book suggests that the reporters write the headline. I've never seen that done with any daily newspaper. Maybe they are now. I used to do it as a weekly editor. I would ask the reporters, go ahead and try writing a headline. And it helped give me a head start. But in the daily paper I was at, that was never even a consideration. The reporters never wrote the headline. The content editors never wrote the headline. It was the copy editors had the responsibility for laying out the page, designing the page, writing the headlines, making sure the captions were good, writing from scratch or revising whatever the photo editor gave us, pulling out the blurbs, the pull out quotes, anything. Once we were given a bare bones story, and we handled all the layout and design and all the content that went with it, including headlines. And so that was one of the main areas where we would be criticized, was how we wrote headlines. That was our job. And it's not an easy job. You want to tell the story in 4 or 5 words in many cases. And nowadays, it's been more of a trend to use subheadlines, as I mentioned, or summary sentences in that same location in order to tell more of the story, so that you're not so trapped in trying to tell an entire story in 5 words. Anyway, we'll talk about that another time. So this is where I pick up from the crash course, and I'm going to do a lot of reading here because, again, it's cognitive conflict to have all these words on a page and then say something else. And so there's not much. There are actually quite a few slides. Most of them don't have this many words. But this is going to be what you're responsible for, and quizzes and so forth in the final exam. Anything from this chapter could go. And since this is an editing class, in some ways, this is the most important chapter, although I didn't really write the crash course for editors. I wrote it, so when I wrote this chapter, it was more that every writer has to be their own editor to some degree. And so I really wrote it to the writers still. So it was still written to the reporters. It was never, I never expanded this book to include professional editors. But nonetheless, it has the very basics of being a professional editor in it, because it's, whether I'm telling reporters this or telling a prospective editor this, these are the same, the most basics, the basics of being an editor. Obviously, we have a thick book to tell us how to be an editor, and that's too thick of a book. That's why we're going to learn desktop publishing, and why we're going to do our work in an environment that's similar to a newspaper environment. And you're going to be writing headlines using desktop publishing. You're going to be designing pages using desktop publishing. We're going to talk about the principles of how to lay out and design, headline a newspaper, and you're going to do it in desktop publishing because that's the real world. And so that's when I took over the class, I pretty much insisted on that we were going to get desktop publishing. Last year, they had none at all, so I used a freeware that, by the way, as I went through, I went ahead and downloaded a free 1-week subscription to Quark Express, and I noticed that the freeware that we used last year is very, very similar to Quark. Not as fast, not as complete, but nonetheless, a lot of the keys on how to organize a page and set up a page are the same with the freeware we used and Quark Express. Okay, so every journalist needs to be an editor, even if they never carry the title of editor. All journalists are at the very least need to understand how to edit their own copy more effectively. Editing is an essential process of journalism. No matter how proficient we are as journalists, we can always do better. What we produce probably is never perfect, and certainly not what we have produced in first draft. In editing, we are taking another critical look at how we might improve what may have been written in considerable haste. As a professional editor, you would not just be changing misspelling, poor grammar, and bad punctuation. As an editor, you are not just allowed but expected to rewrite entire paragraphs if necessary to improve a story. You may frequently be a story's final judge and jury, what the last line says. So you are the final judge and jury and you have the ultimate responsibility of what it looks like when it is actually in print. So, proceeding, read the copy as objectively and as distantly as possible. That is, going on, try to look at it as your most uninformed but critical readers might. If it's your own story, try to put it aside for a while before editing so you can see it with fresh eyes. How long you can put it aside depends on your deadline and circumstances. It's hard to be your own editor. You've all probably seen on Facebook or places like that, you've been challenged to find, the redundant words or whatever, where they're going to put the word the twice in a row. And especially it's on a different line, the at the end of one line and the at the beginning of the next line. It's very hard to catch that. Our minds are made to fill in the blanks. And so we know, especially if we're editing our own work, we know what we intended to say. And so it's very hard for us to find mistakes that we ourselves make. Yet, as I mentioned earlier, that's why I actually wrote this section, was to help reporters to be better editors of their own work and in whatever other roles they might have. And so when I do academic stuff, I don't have somebody else read behind me. I do it myself, but I put it aside for a couple of days and go back through it again so I can see it with fresh eyes. If one of the things that I'm not sure if I say it, I may come to it again. One of the things that I always, if I have to read a paragraph twice, I always then stop and analyze, why did I have to read this twice to understand it? And even if I put it aside a couple of days, that could be my own writing. Maybe it's just because I have a bad memory, I don't know. But I think you would find also that if you put a story you've written aside for a couple of days and go back to it, that you may stop and ask yourself, what was I saying here? And so if you have to stop and ask yourself, what did I intend to say? What was I trying to explain here? Then you can be fairly sure that either you misread it the second time or you need to rewrite it. If you did not misread it and you had questions as to what you meant, then you better look very, very seriously at rewriting what stopped you and made you read twice, because that's your job. And especially if you're an editor, if that's your title, an editor, you have to do that. But you should also do that if you're a reporter. Put it aside, read it again, and if you have to stop to understand what you just explained, what you wrote yourself, then you better, again, unless you misread what you wrote, it probably means you need to rewrite it. If you had to stop and ask yourself, what did I mean? Don't just jump over that. Listen inside your mind for awkward, confusing, or uninformative sentences. If you need to read anything twice, I just got back to where I came from. In order to understand it, you should probably edit or rewrite it. Again, the exception would be if you just simply misread it the second time. But if it's not that you misread it, but you actually read what you wrote or what somebody else wrote, and you had to read it twice, then you better, if you had to read it twice, a lot of your readers are going to have to read it twice. You do not want readers to have to read something twice. That should be a rule of thumb, no reading twice. This should be clear enough. If I have to break the sentence in half, why is it that I misread this, or why is it that I misunderstood this and had to read it twice? If you had to do it, you have to assume other people will too. Don't stop, don't let it go. Look for content errors that might cause your publication embarrassment or legal problems. Look for even the smallest errors in facts, punctuation, grammar, spelling, or style. What's unimportant to you may be extremely important to someone else. Probably the most frustrating thing to an editor is to have a reporter who doesn't care, is sloppy and doesn't care. I remember, I was just thinking about this last night when I was running the track, of a student I had more than 30 years ago. It was one of my best reporters, absolutely, and I still don't know exactly how I treated him, with a grade and so forth, because he was not just one of, he was my best reporter. The class I was teaching included the student news. We put out the student newspaper. We wrote and edited and published the student newspaper. And so he was one of my reporters for the student newspaper. And he won some prizes in competition with other bigger universities. He was a very good reporter, and the essence of what he was writing was good, but he was floppy with his spelling and grammar. Now, in those days, this was in the mid-'80s. It was before Microsoft gained a monopoly on the operating system, so not all software worked for all the computers, things like that. The spell and grammar checks weren't as sophisticated as they are now. So I could give him a little bit of a pass. I think I gave him a pretty good grade because I wanted him to have a chance to become a professional, because I thought he was worth it as a reporter. But I certainly had some discussions with him about not being so lazy about his spelling and grammar. That's hard for me. It was, again, I don't know exactly, I honestly don't know exactly how I handled his case, but I remember the conflict in my mind. My best reporter is so dang lazy about his spelling and grammar, he's driving me crazy. And I don't know, he may have never gotten he may have never become a professional journalist because of that, even though he was an excellent reporter. And he certainly had every opportunity to be a world-class reporter, I felt. So I didn't know how to handle this situation. Don't be lazy. Look for unanswered questions, information gaps, contradictions. All these are possibilities. Again, so it's totally missing, and you have this idea or this question pops into your head. Wait, how about this? If that question pops into your head, it's going to pop into the head of your other readers. You need to pursue any unanswered questions that come into your mind. Information gaps, another way of just explaining that basically they have information, but there's some information just not there. They didn't finish their reporting. Or even worse are contradictions, where they say one thing and then they say something else that seems to be a contradiction. Maybe in their head it was not a contradiction. Maybe it's a matter of a different source. So one source disagreed with the first source. Whatever it is, you can't leave that contradiction in the story without making it very, very clear that, yes, we recognize there's a contradiction here, and that people are disagreeing with each other, whatever the case might be. You can't just leave it in there without addressing that there is a contradiction and why there's a contradiction. So those, as an editor, whether you're a content editor or a copy editor, you have to be looking for those things. Check verifiable information, such as names and addresses, unless you are assured that they have already been confirmed. If in doubt, check again. You need to be extremely meticulous as an editor. And so you need to be, my wife, kids jokes about how observant I am about people. I'm always looking at what people are doing around me. And I may point stuff out to her because that's my job. As a journalist, and especially as an editor, I have to be thinking about lots of things at the same time. And so if anything pops into your head, not necessarily that you saw something wrong, but it occurred to you that this might be something they could have a problem with. You're always looking, for example, did they spell a name that was kind of oddly spelled, you know, did they spell it the same way every time? Be very cognizant that they spell a person's name the same every time, especially if it's a harder name. You very frequently see names misspelled when it's a little more difficult name, an unusual spelling of a name. You very frequently find that error, and that's something that's not going to be caught by spell check. Actually, in modern Word, I notice it does. Actually, if you misspell a name, it will catch it the second time or the third time you spell it. So if you pay attention, Word does try to help you with this, but it certainly didn't used to. So be very, very aware of those little things and try to catch them. Beware of bias, personal opinion, unclearly attributed opinion. So this is where I said, I explained, pausing here, going to my own words, my own live words, whatever. If the reason why we make indirect quotes type 1 is that we don't want our reader thinking that we as the reporter or that the reporter, we're the editor, is expressing his bias or his opinion. And if you make an indirect quote a type 2, where the attribution is at the end, the reader is reading this whole thing is filled with its biased opinion, and you don't find out that it wasn't the reporter, it was an actual person he was quoting until you get to the end. So you don't want that to happen. So that's why you put, in a case of an indirect quote or paraphrase, you want the attribution to the start. You don't need that when you have quote marks, because then the quote marks tell the reader, okay, this is, somebody said this, we're quoting somebody. So then you can do what's better for the flow of the story, and that is put what's interesting at the start and put the attribution later on. What's interesting is what they said, not who said it. So type, again, in print journalism, not broadcast journalism. Broadcast journalism, everything's an indirect quote that's not being seen on video, basically, in broadcast journalism. Because you're not going to say, open quote, end quote. You don't say that in broadcast journalism. So they don't know what's a direct quote if you're this talking head in broadcast journalism. So in that case, everything, you have to presume everything is an indirect quote in broadcast journalism, unless it's on video. So your video is your direct quote. Your talking head, everything's an indirect quote. Attribution needs to come at the start. But with print journalism, we have the quote marks, so we can put the attribution in the middle or at the end, type 2 or type 3. Okay. Anyway, so we don't want one-sided coverage of an issue. Strive to uphold the professional standards of objectivity and fairness, as impossible as that may be to achieve. I actually have done quite a bit of research on the impossibility of being objective. But that doesn't mean you can't try. And probably the standard is more fairness than objectivity. If you are doing everything you can to be fair, in the sense of having both sides of the story, a fairly equal number of sources from liberal and conservative, or from two sides of an issue, may not be, if it's not politics, it may not be liberal and conservative. It may be corporate versus union. It may be one team versus another team. It may be the sports league versus the team or an individual, or whatever the sides, however they choose up, so to speak. You want to be as fair to both sides as you can be. Going back to what we said the other day, though, if you have the facts to prove that they're lying, you want to use those facts. You don't want to hide those facts. That's not part of being fair and objective. It's to hide information you have that appears to prove this person's lying. Then you go with truth. Truth is your most important standard, is truth. Don't allow yourself to be so close to the story that you presume your readers share the same information or understanding. Even if many stories have been written on the topic, you cannot afford to presume your reader has read every one of the other stories, nor that he has not possibly read all of them. In other words, the story should review background adequately so that anyone would understand, but not repeat so much old news as to bore the more informed readers. In practical terms, follow-up stories usually reserve the second and sometimes the third paragraphs for review, but emphasize new information in the lead and in the body of the story. So this is particularly true then, as suggested here, if you have a story that goes on for many days, such as a crime story. You start off knowing that a crime was committed, you have no idea who committed it. And so you go back and you're writing about the same subject day after day after day. Then it starts to tail off if there's no new news. So maybe it's gone for a week. You write about it again. In the story that Peter Fleeth won the Pulitzer Prize for, it was a family suddenly disappeared. A man and wife and two children disappeared, and nobody knew where they went to. It turned out that they tried to take a shortcut through the mountains during winter, and they got trapped on this very narrow road that turned from pavement into dirt, and they got trapped up there. And I can't remember, I know the husband died. I'm not sure about the wife and kids anymore, but anyway, at least somebody died in this whole ordeal. But meanwhile, they went weeks trying to find this family, or at least days, and then trying to answer the questions, why did this happen? One of the questions ended up being cell phone coverage. Do we have to have better mobile phone coverage up in the mountains? They had their mobile phones, but nobody could hear them. And then it even got further than that, that there were experts who knew how to, even if a mobile phone call could not get out, there were still telltale signs that an expert could find that a call was attempted at a certain area. And that was the searchers did not know that. So there were a whole bunch of things that then this team of reporters, headed up by Peter Fleeth, had to write story after story after story after story. From the time they were missing, nobody knew where they were. The time they were found, and the tragedy of it, to then how can this be prevented in the future, and going into the how and why questions, how this happened and why it happened, why they couldn't be found, and so forth. So every time they wrote a story, how much of the old news do you report? That is what I'm talking about here. You cannot, as either the editor or the reporter, presume that everybody knows the story, even though it may be the 5th story you wrote on the subject. You can't presume that people knew that they read any of the previous stories. At a certain point, maybe you start your review of the past stories becomes shorter and shorter, but you at least have to mention some of the facts to help jar their memory. Maybe they heard it on the radio or on the TV news. They have some idea that this is going on, that this search for this family was going on, or whatever. But you have to always, as I said here, don't allow yourself to be so close to the story that you presume your readers share the same information or understanding. This may also relate, I'm more specifically addressing a sequence of stories, a series of stories, but it could also refer to sports or economics or some other specialized area. Don't presume that your readers know everything you know. So be very careful of jargon that you might use that is very common in your area of expertise in economics and business, whatever it might be that you're talking about. In fact, all those areas that could have a content editor also probably has some jargon that nobody else understands except maybe the Metro editor. Other than that, the education editor, the national editor, the economics editor, or the business editor, whatever, they all, the sports editor, all come from an area where there's jargon. And you have to be very careful. You don't want to treat your readers like idiots, but you can't also treat them like they're experts. So there's some middle ground somewhere in there, and you have to find that middle ground. Similarly, don't presume, okay, sorry, I just redundant here. Similarly, don't presume readers have an understanding of specialized terminology. Specialized reporters covering government, economics, law, art, and even sports erroneously presume at times that everyone understands their subject as well as they do, when in reality, many do not. Some presumption is obviously necessary, but an astute journalist would not make these presumptions haphazardly and would add definitions, clarifications, examples, and illustrations as needed. Watch for unjustified use of descriptors. Generally, it is better, more precise, and ultimately more accurate to describe without using superlatives at all. So this is where we were talking about, rather than saying best or most or expert, start trying to get some facts. The author of 10 books on the subject, whatever. Some facts that you can document and not just try to gloss over it by using a superlative or a descriptor that anybody could disagree with. Let me put it that way, at least that anybody could disagree with. There are exceptions. Stephen Hawking would have been an exception at some point. Everybody knew who Stephen Hawking was. One of the great scientists of our time who recently died. So there comes a point where somebody's so famous that you don't, frankly, you don't have to use even descriptors even. You just presume people know. I mean, you might use something in there, a descriptor, maybe a fact, something to remind people who Stephen Hawking is or was. But anyway, you have to be careful about using descriptors, best, most. Same with pretty, wonderful, any subjective adjectives, try to stay away from it. Similarly, picking up down towards the bottom, similarly, eliminate such trite and dubious assertions as a good time was had by all. That's especially, that sort of an ending comes with at the bottom, a lot of amateur writing. Don't use it. Instead, insist on factual, precise, verifiable detail and description. This is where I say in your own writing, if you feel a need to write a conclusion, have a direct or indirect quote from somebody. But you have to remember that direct or indirect quote that you're using as a conclusion may get cut from the story. So it should not be an important direct or indirect quote. It can be usable, but not. You should not cry if they cut that paragraph out, because it may happen. So anything important, stick higher in the story. Strive for brevity and simplicity. It's a real challenge, but much of what we write could be cut by 1/3 and end up communicating more to our readers. Avoid wordiness, complexity, and unproductive temptation to impress the readers with style or advanced vocabulary. Don't be trite, profound, or stilted. Just write clearly. Check the lead to make sure it, A, emphasizes the whammy of the story, B, is concise, fewer than 35 words, C, adequately summarizes or represents the rest of the story's contents. In other words, just because you find a whammy that you say, wow, I need to use this in my lead, this is got to get people's attention. If you haven't followed up on that question, if there's something in that story that is the wow factor, and you didn't bother to ask more questions about it, you can't use it as your whammy. Your lead, what says number D, is truly leads the rest of the story. Your lead has to lead. It has to lead into the most important part of the story. So if you, in retrospect, you have gone back and you go through your notes and say, wow, he said this, if you didn't ask further questions, you can't use it in your lead. You might be able to use it someplace in your story, but even then, if you did not follow up with additional questions, no matter how big a wow factor, unless you have time to go ask some more questions, you can't use that in your lead for sure. And it's doubtful you can use it any place. You might want to save it and do another story now that you realize you're an idiot, okay? That there was a wow factor you didn't follow up on. And by the way, I've been that idiot sometimes. When you're in a hurry or whatever, something goes by you and you don't realize how important it was until you're done with the interview, you're back writing the story, and you realize, good heavens, why didn't I follow up on that question? I can't remember specific times, but I know I've had that feeling of, oh, I am an idiot. So, yeah, watch for that. Do your interviews well. But again, the most important thing is your lead has to lead. And so you can't choose a whammy that doesn't lead into the rest of the story. And I see that a lot from student writers. They choose a lead that doesn't lead. They choose a whammy that doesn't lead into the rest of the story. You can't do that. You're going to have a lead that leads. Going on. The lead is the most important part of the story and will determine how many readers continue reading the story or move on to another. So as an editor, you have to back check as a copy editor, you back check the content editor, and the content editor back checks the reporter. Everybody's looking to make sure that lead does a good job. Check transitions. Make sure the reader flows smoothly from the lead into the body of the story. Smooth out any rough transitions into quotes or through the story's changes in topic or source. So we've gone over this before in class. One reason, again, why I suggest not exactly, but more or less going indirect quote, direct quote, indirect quote, direct quote, indirect quote, direct quote to some degree is because your indirect quotes or paraphrases help lead into the next quote. And if a transition has to take place, it's going to take place in your writing, not in their writing, not in their quotes. The transition has to take place in your paraphrase or the way you handle the indirect quote will have to lead the reader into the next next idea. And so this, to have a smooth flowing story, it works out to me easiest to go from indirect quote to direct quote, indirect quote to direct quote, and let my words then cause the transition. And finally, make sure that you are consistent in order to avoid apparent conflicts in style. Most publications have adopted some standards, such as the Associated Press Style Book, which you should be using in conjunction with this workbook, referring to my crash course. Sorry, I should have just cut that part out. Refer to AP for greater detail, but here are a few examples of important style rules you should keep in mind. Now, somebody in each of the tutorials will be covering the AP Style Book. I'm going to go ahead here and start and cover what I can out of the most basics of AP Style. So listen up. This will be important. There will definitely be questions on quizzes and exams about style, because if nothing else, if the newspapers here don't use AP Style, they have to have some kind of style. You have to be alert to style. And as we go through this, you'll see the sort of questions they're trying to answer and why there has to be style rules. Every professional publication has to go by some kind of style rules. If they don't adopt AP, then they have to create their own. That's one reason why most of them steal a lot of stuff for AP Style. Even if they end up doing a lot of their own style, they make a lot of exceptions, whatever. If they put a new title in the front, they in essence are going to steal a lot of it from AP, from Associated Press, and then they put their own stuff in, because that's a lot easier than starting from total scratch. And the AP Style Book is pretty thick. It's in alphabetical order. It does have the punctuation guide towards the back that covers all punctuation, basically. But it's organized very well. They've been working on it. They update it every year for decades, trying to keep it fresh and up to date. And so it'd be pretty stupid for a publication not to start with the AP Style Book, frankly. And I don't know of any newspapers that are good newspapers that start from scratch. It's too hard to start from scratch. Obviously, if it's in a foreign language, then they have a whole different set of problems, so they may have no choice but to start from scratch, because a lot of the stuff in AP Style Book does not relate to any other language. Some does. Some of the stuff does, but a lot of it does not. So if it's another language, I don't know what style they use. But if you don't use a style, that means you're going to have a lot of inconsistencies in your presentation, and it's going to make you look like amateurs. Every academic journal declares to the writers, I'm preparing a journal article right now, and so that's one of my main things I have to do this next week, is finish up this article, and I have to know exactly what style they're using, because in academic, there's more styles than there are in journalism, in a sense. Again, there may be more styles, but they're mostly based on the AP style, so they're similar. Whereas academic style, it can really screw you up. If you use APA style, you don't use the first names of anybody, the given name. And so then you've changed your whole report to APA style, and then you go to another one, and now they're using their first names. So you better not delete the first name. You better keep a copy with their first names, because if you end up submitting to a different journal, you need the first names. And I've made that mistake before, where I had to go look up all the first names again, because I deleted the first names going by APA style, which is not the same as other style in academic writing. But luckily, journalism is fairly consistent with relatively few exceptions. Okay, so we're going to start going through basically AP style and some of the key aspects of that style, and that you are expected to know. When writing about an event 6 days before or after the day of publication, this is really mostly true about a daily newspaper, and I'll come back and address that in a second. Use the day of the week and not the date. So if you're working at a daily newspaper, the council met Monday, refers to the Monday prior to the publication. The council will meet Thursday refers to the next Thursday after the publication. It is 6 days before and after because you also use, I suppose I meant to say here, need an editor, use the day on the actual date of the publication. So the date you have today, that's your referral to today is today. So you don't use that day of the week or the date, you're saying today. And so 6 days before, day of the week, 6 days after, day of the week, and your verb will tell your reader whether it's the past 6 days or the future 6 days, or today. Where's I at? If a newspaper comes out on Tuesday morning and there is a council meeting the day you would write, that day you would write, the council will discuss the budget at Tuesday's meeting, not today's meeting, because that's when you're writing and it's going to come out the next day. So if you're writing on Tuesday, the readers aren't going to see it till Wednesday. So you're going to say Tuesday's meeting. When an event is more than 6 days before or after the day of the publication, use the date only. Don't say the meeting is set for Monday, October 18th, but simply October 18th, once you get past those 6 days before or after. The reader can look at his own calendar if he wants to know the day of the week. Okay, that's for a daily newspaper. If you're doing a weekly newspaper or a free newspaper, when you don't know when people are going to read it, even if there are not very many cases of this, but there are a few newspapers that are daily, but they're just handed out at restaurants and stuff. So you don't really know for sure that somebody doesn't pick it up the next day, a day later. So in that case, particularly with a weekly or a monthly news publication, then you need to decide what's going to be your style. Will you only use dates and no days of the week? Will you use both of them? You do have to decide. So again, everybody has to have a style, and it will change by your circumstances. So with my weekly newspapers, I would typically go with just the date. I would never use the day of the week because I had no idea when people were going to read the newspaper. A weekly newspaper in America usually stays in the home longer than a daily paper. People are just used to throwing the daily paper away each day because, why? It's old news and we have a new newspaper on the doorstep. So the daily paper gets thrown away every day, whereas if they're from a small town, they also get a local weekly newspaper. They keep that around for a while because they're not going to get another one until the next week. So they can keep that one around for a whole week. So that's one argument I do for advertising when I'm a weekly newspaper editor or publisher, is the daily paper gets thrown out, ours stays around for repeat readership. So, our advertising is worth more, consequently. Also, it's worth more because our paper is smaller than their paper. Ours is read by more people, so forth. So there are arguments for a weekly newspaper. Days and dates. When writing about an event, or am I just saying the same thing? Yeah, okay, I thought I put that separately. Okay, approximation and timeliness. Always emphasize the most local and most timely angles possible. Don't make readers think a story is national if the interview was done locally. Don't use a yesterday angle if there is a good today angle available. And avoid the waffling reference to recently. Typically, if you're going to put a date on it, then put a date on it. There may be, again, exceptions to the recently. If you are indeed a weekly newspaper and you're trying to avoid showing that you're a little bit dated, and particularly say you're doing an issue-oriented story, therefore you're using present tense attribution, says, whatever. Then maybe recently is okay because you're referring to something past, but that's not the point of your story. But again, the recent city council meeting, they passed taxes, and your story is the pros and cons of them passing taxes. So you're using present tense verbs, you're doing issue-oriented, about something that happened recently at a council meeting, even then, why not say the date? You're just making reference to it. So the council decided on May 1st to raise taxes. Why not say the date? But now you're going on to the issue, and your story is issue-oriented, so you're using present tense verbs because it's the fact that they raised taxes on that day isn't the point of your story. The point of your story is whether they were right, whether it's a good idea to raise taxes or not. So you're issue-oriented, you're not event-oriented. Names and titles. There are several slides on this, so because there's lots of issues related to names and titles. For both men and women, use first and last name, surname, in first reference without any courtesy title, according to Associated Press. Miss, Mr., Mrs., Ms. are the courtesy titles. So you refer to George Jones or Jill Jones, not to Mr. George Jones or Mrs. Jill Jones. On second reference, for both men and women, typically use only last name, surname, family name, if you would. Jones. Some newspapers take exception to this rule, as did the daily paper I used to work for, and tell their journalists to always use a courtesy title with second reference. One problem with changing this rule is when reporters fail to ask which courtesy title a woman would like. In this age of women's liberation and so forth, they will sometimes take exception to your courtesy title. And so part of a reporter's job, if you use the rule, if you ignore AP style and you have a local rule that you're going to use courtesy titles, you have to ask that question. Which courtesy title do you want me to use of women? Are you Mrs., are you Miss, are you Ms.? And let them tell you, because some of them will be very offended. If they're very into women's rights, they want to be Ms. Doesn't matter whether they're married or not, they're Ms. And so you do not want them angry at you. You have to ask them, what do they want? And that's one reason not to do it, by the way. That's a reason to keep AP style, is not to have to ask that question. You don't know how many times the reporters have come back without asking that question. And it becomes a problem then for the editor. What does the editor do? He wasn't there to ask the question. Does he have to call him up and try to find, it seems like a silly question, an almost meaningless question, but it isn't meaningless to some people, particularly, obviously, in this case, women. Okay, under AP style, you do use courtesy titles if needed to distinguish between a man and a wife, referred to in the same story. Mr. Jones died in the crash, but Mrs. Jones survived. Okay, so now you have two Joneses. You have to distinguish between them, and so you start using your courtesy titles, or you're going to have to use their first names. I've seen some use the first names instead of using the courtesy titles. But you have to distinguish. You can't say Jones died and Jones lived. Obviously, that doesn't work. And so you have to decide how you're going to distinguish between them. AP style says use courtesy titles only within direct quotes, or if a woman specifically requests it. Otherwise, other than the situation where you have to clarify. Do not use a person's first name alone, except in a column or feature story where such intimacy is not offensive. It would more commonly be used with stories about children. So if you're writing about a little child, it seems a little strange to call them Smith or whatever their family name is. And so if for some reason you're writing a story about a child who's won the National Spelling Bee or something, then you might very well use their first name, because you have a sense of intimacy. This is a child. It just doesn't feel right to call them by their last name. So there are exceptions to it. There are not specific rules for it. So that's one area where AP has not tried to say if they're younger than 8, you can use their first name or something like that. They haven't done that. And there may be, as I said, even for adults, feature stories where you end up using the first name because you're trying to make it sound more intimate, more personal, and so forth, more humanized, and last name does not contribute to that. Put long titles, more than 2 words, after the name, not in front of it. For example, AP says, John Hart, Secretary of Commerce, is better than Secretary of Commerce John Hart. Because now this is a long title, Secretary of Commerce. So if you have that situation, if you have a long title, put it afterwards. Going on related to this, as in the example above, the Secretary of Commerce example, capitalize a title if it comes directly before a name, but lowercase it if it comes after the name. Okay, so in the case of Secretary of Commerce, John Hart, let me go back to it so you can see it. If it comes after the name, it's usually then within commas, John Hart, comma, Secretary of Commerce, comma, did something or other. So the title in that case becomes parenthetical in a sense. It becomes extra information. So John Hart, comma, title, comma, and then you go on with the main subject or the main action of the sentence. But again, if you put that title ahead of the name, there's no comma, then it's capitalized. Now, if I don't use this as another exception, if for some reason the name becomes parenthetical, so you're saying the U.S. Secretary of Commerce or the U.S. Secretary of State, let's say, and then you put comma and put their name. So it would sound fine if you took out their name at that point. The U.S. Secretary of State issued a warning of terrorism, whatever. Okay, that was the sentence, but you put in commas in a kind of a parenthetical way, Hillary Clinton or whoever it might be at the time. So then if you did that, if the name became parenthetical, then the title coming ahead of it would also be lowercase. It would be lowercase because now it's being treated not like the title is, how do I say this? Well, in this case, like I say, there's no comma before it, so it becomes kind of part of the name, you might say. So Secretary of Commerce John Hart, it capitalizes the title. But if there's a comma after commerce for some reason, then no, it'd be lowercase. Okay. Going on with this one then, capitalize the title if it comes directly before a name, or lowercase it if it comes after the name. Give exact titles. Don't make the mistake of presuming that president, prime minister, or chairman are synonymous. They're not synonymous. There is an official name and there's an unofficial name. You might call them the head of state. That's unofficial. That's not anybody's, at least it's very rarely recognized as the actual name of or the actual title of somebody. So make sure you're accurate on the title and don't, in the academic setting here, for example, professor is very different than instructor. We may sometimes use professor as kind of a catch-all, but the more, you have to be very careful in a university setting because that's not it's one or the other. And in fact, then it gets more specific. You have an instructor, a senior instructor, an assistant professor, an associate professor, and a professor. And they're all different. They're all different ranks. And so in an academic setting like this, if you're writing about professors here, you should probably be exact in what their title is. If you're writing in a newspaper and it's kind of not relevant, other than he teaches at a university. In that case, you might say use professor in a very generic way. Or you might say instructor in a very generic way and not worry about his exact title, possibly. You know, that's kind of a call that you and your editors would be making. Do you use the exact title or are you just using it generically? But once you get to the university campus, now I don't think you should be doing that. For a university newspaper, a university publication like those that we're going to produce, now you should be precise. Instructor, senior instructor, assistant professor, associate professor, professor. Okay, they're all different. And by the way, here it seems to matter more than other places. People keep telling me, gee, you should always call yourself Professor Harvey because professor really well respected here in Malaysia. Professor is really important. So that's why I've always been, that's what everybody's telling me, that I need to say Professor Harvey, because everybody's going to respect me if I'm a professor. It's not so revered in other countries, let me put it that way. Okay, abbreviations. Avoid abbreviations that the average reader will not grasp quickly. When using the name of an organization, it is best to spell the name out on first reference. Then use the abbreviation or shortened version of the name thereafter. For example, write the Federal Communication Commission the first time, but refer to the FCC thereafter. While it is common to see non-newspaper writers place an abbreviation in parentheses following the first spelled out reference, AP says this is unnecessary. So in the very example that I put here, the Federal Communications Commission and FCC, you don't say Federal Communications Commission, parentheses, FCC, parentheses, and then start using FCC. That is a style for academic writing, but it's not a style for Associated Press writing. They presume that you're smart enough to see that we were talking about Federal Communications Commission, and now we're saying FCC. It's the same thing. Okay, so there are times when there's so many things like that you do have to go back and look. Like, see, what did those initials stand for? I've caught myself going back and having to remind myself what certain initials in a news story meant. Nonetheless, that's the AP style. They want to be consistent with it, so first time, spell it out. There are also, however, as I'm going to read here, some exceptions where the initials are more famous than the name. Therefore, they don't even bother with the initials. They are rather with the name. They just go straight to the initials. So let me go on with this paragraph. If the second reference use of an abbreviation is not obvious to the reader, the AP style book says to keep using the spelled out name. So some abbreviations are, on the other hand, some abbreviations are more widely recognized than their organization's full name, such as FBI, CIA, YMCA, UCLA, AFL-CIO. These, at least in America, these are very common acronyms, or initials anyway, and in such cases you may use the abbreviation even on the first reference. Because as I said, FBI, some people don't know what the FBI stands for, Federal Bureau of Investigations, but they know what FBI means. A lot of people don't know what CIA represents. The Central Intelligence, what's the A stand for? CIA, I'm not sure what A stands for. CIA. So you don't even know what it stands for anymore. It's the initials. And so you just go straight to the initials when they become that famous that nobody knows what they stand for anymore. Go to the initials. Agency, Central Intelligence Agency. Abbreviations. Capitalize and abbreviate street, boulevard, avenue, and drive when writing a specific address. So it's 134 North University Avenue. You abbreviate North and you abbreviate Avenue. Now that also, by the way, presumes that North isn't really part of in America frequently, I don't know how it is here, I don't think it is, but in America, you usually have kind of a center, you cut the city in quadrants, 4 quadrants. And so at some street, north of that is now north whatever, and south of that is south whatever. So in this case, University, the name of the avenue is University Avenue. But once you go past the main street, north of it is North University, south of it is South University. And the numbering begins again. So there's a 134 North University and there's a 134 South University. So the initial is very important, but it's still University Street, or University Avenue in this case. So you spell out these words when writing about the street in general, not referring to a specific address. So if you're just referring to University Avenue, you spell it out. Once you put the exact address on it, you abbreviate Avenue, and if it's a city where there's north and south, you have to put in the north or south on it. Spell out these words, as I said, when it's not specific. Abbreviate months with more than 4 letters when used in a specific date. So September 24th, 1982. Again, this however, also relates to whether it's within the last year. If you say September 24th and leave off the date, the presumption is this year. Whether it's past or future, if you leave off the year, the presumption is this year. So don't put in the year if it's unless it's not this year. Okay? But meanwhile, you abbreviate September, you do not abbreviate May. For example, let's see, April is, it says 4 letters. April. I thought April was also spelled out. It says 4 letters here. I'm not sure I'm right. June is 4 letters. So there's no abbreviation for June, no abbreviation for July. So anyway. So if it has the exact date, 24th, you abbreviate it. Spell out the name of the month when used alone or with the year only. So September 2008 would be different. Would be spelled out. Generally, write out the name of the state when it is used alone, a town in Alabama. Abbreviate the name of the state with 6 letters or more when it is used with the name of a city, Selma, Alabama. AP, I believe, still goes with their traditional abbreviations. In America, there are traditional abbreviations and there are postal abbreviations. All the postal abbreviations are only 2 letters. So Washington is WA. AP style abbreviation for Washington is WASH, period. So unless they've changed it, and I'd have to, maybe those of you that are doing the tutorials will tell me that they've now changed it. They were using the traditional abbreviations and not the postal abbreviations. Okay, so the exception are the 2 states outside the continental United States, Alaska and Hawaii, are not abbreviated despite having 6 letters each. So they're different. They don't, I don't know why. That doesn't make a lot of sense why they're not abbreviated, except they're the other states. They're not the true states. They're the adopted states. They're not the true states. I don't know what it is. Doesn't make any sense. But that at least has been the rule of Associated Press. Again, you may find they've changed that if those that are doing the updates on, and if you use the 2015 version of the AP style book in the library, which I encourage you to do, you may find that they've updated some of this stuff and changed it. Do not abbreviate Christmas, %. You don't use the percentage sign except in tables or something, but in your actual sentence structure, you don't use percentage signs. Names of persons or cities, days of the week, you don't abbreviate. Points of the compass, north and south, if it's used as directions. And with an ampersand, no. Weights or measures, pound or foot, abbreviated, don't do that, except in creating tables and charts. Do not abbreviate such words as company, association, university, department, or building unless abbreviated in the official name. More in capitalization. Capitalize formal names of religious, political, and public or private organizations. Protestant, Mormon, Franciscan, Communist Party, Republican, Alpine School Board, Niagara Falls Convention Center, Jensen and Company, Sears Department Store, Lincoln High School, Buffalo City Council, Tampa Police Department, Utah State Legislature. All of these would be capitalized. Capitalize the names of specific public bodies, even if the complete formal name is not used. The City Council, when you are talking about the Buffalo City Council, or you're talking about a very specific City Council, your stories about that City Council, keep it capitalized. If it's specific, the Senate, the House, referring to the Senate of Congress or the legislature, the House referring to the House of Representatives in Congress, or a legislature would also have a House in many cases. The police department, the county commission, the General Assembly, whatever. If it's referring to a specific one, go ahead and keep it capitalized, even though you're not giving the full name. Capitalize formal names of ethnic groups and nationalities. African American, Caucasian, Chinese, Russian, Those are capitalized by AP. More on capitalization. Capitalized national, regional, state, local, or political subdivisions. Now this includes, this is kind of tricky, so be aware of this. The Northwest, or the Northeast, I guess it says here. The Northeast means probably not really an exact designation. Maybe somebody has an exact designation, but Maine, New Hampshire, Rhode Island, the states of America that are in the Northeast can be referred to as the Northeast. And that would be capitalized because it's referring to a region. I live in the Northwest of America, in Washington State. So Washington, Oregon, Idaho can refer to as the Northwest, capitalize it. However, if you say, once you change it to an adjective and not a region, it becomes lowercase. So you might say, in the Northeast, the weather's cold. Well, now it's being used as an adjective in the Northeast. If you said the Northeast, not in the Northeast, but the Northeast is colder than the rest of the country. The Northeast. Now it's capitalized. In the Northeast, not capitalized. Now you're using it as a direction. It depends on whether you're treating it as a formal region or whether you're using it as an adjective. Same with Western New York. If you refer to it as a region, you capitalize Western. It's not actually a formal name, but you're referring to it. You're making it a formal name, so to speak. Western New York. There is no political organization called Western New York. That doesn't exist. But you've made it a region, and so you capitalize it. But again, be careful. Once you turn Western into an adjective, now it is no longer the name of a region. It becomes lowercase. So in the western part of New York, or once you use that word "in," it's kind of a key word. In Western New York, be using it as an adjective. But if you say Western New York is, now using it as a region. So there's some fine lines there. Are you using it as a name of a region, or are you using it as an adjective? Makes the difference whether you capitalize or not. Capitalized names and nicknames, including those of animals, cities, states, school, so forth. Jim Brown, if you're talking about the football player, one of the famous American football players, you just refer to him as Jim Brown. Nobody ever called him James Brown. He was never known as James Brown. So you'd confuse people if you called him James Brown. They'd think you're talking about the musician, James Brown. And so if somebody's so well known by their first name, you need to stick with it. Rover, referring to a dog, probably is frequently called Rover. Capitalize it. The Evergreen State is the kind of the nickname of Washington State. So you go ahead and capitalize Evergreen State. It's a nickname. The Big Apple, you all recognize as being New York. And so once you refer to the Big Apple, then you're capitalizing it because you're referring to a very specific city. It's their nickname. Capitalized titles preceding the proper name, but not following it. We've already kind of talked about this. So President Donald Trump, capitalized President. Donald Trump, comma, President of the United States, lowercase president. Even if you put former in front of it, former President George W. Bush, President's capitalized, even though it's former President George W. Bush. And even though I'm using a lot of American examples, if we're going to use Associated Press style, we're going to adapt it to, the local officials, whatever their titles might be. Same principle. Do not capitalize seasons like summer. Points of the compass, northeast. Again, if you're using points of the compass, not a region, but points of a compass. AM or PM, not capitalized, lowercase. Names of studies except languages, such as mathematics is lowercase, English is uppercase. Association, club, army, federal, state, government, those are all lowercase, unless used as part of a formal name or title. Okay, punctuation. Commas and periods always go inside the quotation marks. So inside the quotation marks, comma, quotation mark, he emphasized. Other punctuation marks may or may not go inside the quotation marks depending on the circumstances. For example, whether or not a question mark, an exclamation mark, a semicolon, a colon, or a dash should go inside or outside quotation marks depends generally on whether the punctuation pertains to the quoted material or to the sentence as a whole, such as, have you seen Rocky 10? So even though a period would go inside that quotation mark, a question mark does not, because then you change the name of the movie, Rocky 10. That's not the movie. Actually, there is no Rocky 10, I don't believe, right? But anyway, just making it up. So the question mark would change the name of the movie. You don't put it inside the quotation marks. But what can I give you? Quotation, then the question mark is part of the sentence. And so what can I give you? Question mark, quotation mark, she asked. Use commas to set off the identification information of a person unless the identification is preceded by the word of. For example, Jack Thomas, 111 North Main Street. You're putting a comma after Thomas and a comma after street, Jacksonville. But Jack Thomas of 111 North Main Street, you don't need the commas anymore. You made it a prepositional phrase. So now of means you don't need to put commas in. It's now a prepositional phrase. But so of becomes important here. Jack Thomas, comma, 111 North Main Street, comma, or Jack Thompson, of 111 North Main Street. There should be a period after north, after the N and north. Okay, well, there's only like 5 or 6 more slides that I do expect you to go through on your own. And you're probably going to have to go through these, on your own anyway, because these are all things that can end up on a quiz or a test. These are the very basics of AP style, the very basics. And this is just a few pages of a thick book, right? And so, but these are critical pages of style. How do we handle these situations? And these situations that I'm talking about here are seen over and over and over and over again as you write journalism. And so the ones that I've covered in this PowerPoint, which are also, like I said, verbatim from the crash course. So if you go through the PowerPoint, you don't need to go through the crash course. This is verbatim. Then you should have the basics of AP style. I am going to go to the last slide, or the last 2 slides. Even though we live in a computer world, there are times when you may have to do editing by hand. And so it's still in the AP style book, at least it was as of 2005, and I presume it still is in 2015, because there are just times when you need to do hand editing. Sometimes if I say I'm going on a trip, I don't really want to use my computer, I'm sitting there, I have the document in front of me and a pen. I'm going to do hand editing. And so you see here a lot of different codes for how to change the content. You see on the top a paragraph sign is one way of saying start. This is a new paragraph. Indent it. But also in that same sentence, you see a kind of an L shape under it. It was first. That also means start a new paragraph. Break this off into a new paragraph. On the other hand, you see a line going from the end of one sentence to the start of another sentence. That means put these in the same paragraph. These go together in the same paragraph. You see kind of a line there over Jones-Smith. So it goes over Jones and under Smith. That means flip them. Smith first and then Jones second. So this is the transposition. This one looks kind of squarish, whereas in my experience in the real world, it looks a little bit more rounded, as in the very last sentence would be how I would do it and how I see most journalists doing it. AP says it's squarish, I use it more rounded. A circle means do the opposite. So 60 should be numerical, should be 60. So circling the word 60 means put it in the figures, put 60. Or the other way around. There's a circle 9, that means spell it out. There's a circle Oklahoma, that means make it abbreviation. It's Ada, Oklahoma. So the rule is, if it's with the city, abbreviate it. Whereas GA for Georgia, circle GA means write out Georgia. 3 lines underneath a letter means uppercase it. So in this case, Prince Edward, that means 3 lines under it means uppercase the P and the E. A flash through it means lowercase it. So there's no reason to have the T and this uppercase, so flash means lowercase it. Left some extra space between the word accuser. Those 2 circles, a circle above and below means close it up. But next to it, I have 2 words that are, there are 2 words that are put together. They should be separate. They need a space in there, so we put that little Z sort of symbol to say put a space in here. And the next one, it shows a word crossed out, and then stet over that. Stet means put it back the way it was. I made a mistake in my editing. So put it back. Stet means leave it alone. I made a mistake. I'm inserting a word. I put a caret. The caret could go above or below, but I'm putting a little V sort of symbol to show where to put in that word that I left out. So I use that little V to point where it's supposed to be. I put in a word that I want to delete. One way of doing it is to use this little kind of a squiggly, I call it. Means delete it. Center it. And BF means boldface. So here it's saying center Donald Ames and boldface it. JR is putting the bracket on one side. It means push it to the right. Or the bracket to the left, push it to the left. Again, showing how to insert a comma. Is a comma kind of inside that caret, a little upside down V saying put a comma in here. Upside down, coming from the top, would mean put in an apostrophe. So it looks the same, except if you come from the top, it's going to mean apostrophe. If you go from the bottom, it's going to mean a comma. They look the same, but you need to distinguish between an apostrophe and a comma. Double quote marks, you're going to go in from the top. An X with a circle means period. A period with a circle means period. Insert a period here. Sometimes I only put a single line. I think this is maybe a little bit outdated and maybe confusing, but they say if you put in that caret and put it, that if you want a hyphen in there, put like an equal sign. I think that could be confusing. I usually just put 1. But there is a difference between a hyphen and a dash. They're grammatically different. A hyphen is not used the same as a dash. But if you just put a long line, you don't know the difference. So that's why they distinguish between the hyphen and the dash. I don't always go by that. As seen by my version that's in the crash course, it just kind of exemplifies it all. Okay, we're out of time. Please bring up the sign-up sheet. If there's any questions, let me go out into the hall for you to ask questions of me, because I know they need to come in. Okay, thank you.